Welcome to Unlearn, where we talk to industry leaders about unlearning how we go to market.
I'm Kelly Sarabin, and I run Tech Partner Enablement and Advocacy at HubSpot.
And I'm Asher Matthew, co-founder of Partnership Leaders.
The old ways of going to market are getting more expensive and less effective.
To thrive in an era of digital transformation, you have to go to market differently. Let's find out how. Hey everybody, welcome back. We're here with another episode of the Unlearn Podcast. And today the guest that we have is not somebody that you would normally meet. And the way we got to this guest is actually through another guest that we had. And so we're thrilled to have Geoff Parker with us. So Geoff, do you want to tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, sure. So my day job is I'm at the engineering school at Dartmouth College. And I used to be in the business school at Tulane. And so I ride this kind of borderline between business, economics, strategy, and engineering. And really have my whole career. I started out actually as an engineer at General Electric, and then moved into being a finance guy at General Electric, and then moved to being a master's student in engineering at MIT, and then a business school PhD student at MIT, then a business school professor, then an engineering professor. You should get the idea there that either A, I can't make up my mind, or B, I have found the exact place where I should be, which is on that intersection of technology and business, which has been just super fun over the course of my career.
That's super interesting. So when I came to this country, I came and I did the regular immigrant thing, which is go to school for computer science. And then when I got out of college, and I started to actually go code, I only did coding for maybe like a week. And then it was way more interesting to go help the sales team because they had the exact same problem. They were like, can somebody just take what this technology is and explain it to these other people that are business people? And I realized that if you can actually do that, you're going to have a job forever in tech. Or as I'm learning right now, you can go teach. So this is fantastic. You just gave me a brand new idea. Kelly?
Yeah, I will add, because Geoff didn't mention it, but he's the author of The Platform Revolution, which is one of sort of the key books on platform strategy. And I had heard you on my friend's podcast, Unsiloed, and you mentioned that an updated version is coming out. Do we have an ETA on that, or is that still being determined?
Well, our publisher wishes it were yesterday.
So do we.
We're planning to ship it to the publisher. I'm not going to give you a firm date, but it'll definitely be in 2023, hopefully earlier rather than later. I will say that the world is changing so fast around us that in many ways the delay we've had is working to our favor. And in particular in the regulatory space, there's an awful lot of action, but also in this B2B space that I think we're going to spend some time talking about today. I'd say there's been a lot of change, and that's one of the areas that we're going to add a lot of new content. But yeah, I mean, I'll just say a few words about Platform Revolution because that book came out of probably 20 years of research that Marshall Van Alstyne and I had undertaken really from our graduate student days during the dot-com boom, and then kind of observing the dot-com bust around 2000, and then observing the emergence of real business models that actually had a chance of growing, which of course we've seen in the Googles and Amazons, and then later on the kind of Facebooks and their derivative names of Meta and Alphabet now. And then the resurgence of Microsoft, which some had taken for, an ancient history, but then they were able to make some pivots and really become relevant again. So the book was born out of our classes as professors, and we were frustrated because we're like, this is really cool and this is really important, and we only teach 50 or 100 people a year. That feels somehow limiting. So we were pleased that it hit a few 100,000 people in 10 languages and counting. And I think we kind of hit a nerve, if you will, of being able to explain changes that everybody could see around them, and more importantly, give some language, give some frameworks, help people with some common terminology that really helps them communicate more efficiently, understand, because they can see what's happening around them with their own eyes. So that was just sort of a few seconds on where we were coming from on that. And we were fortunate to meet up with Sangeet Chowdhury, who was active in the space as well, but more from a practitioner side. And so that was a nice partnership that continues to this day.
Yeah, so for the new version, have you guys maintained the same definition of a platform? Because something interesting from the operational side and people actually working in the field, especially with B2B SaaS, I think platform means something different for people in B2B SaaS than it would mean in your book, how it was defined in your book. Which is fine as long as everyone understands what we're talking about, right? But I think, for example, Uber, people would look at as like a two-sided marketplace is how they would think of it. And then they think of like Salesforce as a platform, AWS as a platform, Amazon.com as a platform. Have you guys made any changes on that front, or you maintain the definition and just explain what it is for the B2B context?
More the latter. So, and the word I insert when we're talking about some of the examples you just used, Azure, for example, or you know, Google Cloud or AWS, is I'll talk about a technology platform. Just insert the word technology because you're really talking about the technology stack. And then in terms of the types of platforms that we describe in the book and spend a lot of time on, think of those as a business platform. Because a lot of what's going on there is you're thinking about what are the sources of value and what are the business models. Because we talk a lot about different types of users, the network effects that they create for one another, whether those are same side or cross side. And we'll dig into that, I hope, today in kind of our conversation about how you might think about the value kind of evolution, especially in B2B, from kind of conception, launch, growth, maturity, because you'll end up lighting up different buckets of value. And then that definition of a business platform will become incredibly important to kind of help with the mapping.
And Geoff, have you seen changes in the maybe the journeys of the people that are built, the leaders that are designing or sanctioning the building of these platforms?
Well, I'd say, we were literally using the words accidental platforms a decade ago because I think people had not been intentional, but then woke up one day and went, wait a minute, I've got strong network effects. I can clearly see that I'm getting pull. And some people use the word flywheel, but I'm getting some kind of a pull that's kind of independent of the technology value that has as much to do with the user base as it does with the technology. And so some of those firms, so for example, Apple and iTunes, did they wake up one day and say, hey, we're going to build a network effect business? Or did they wake up one day and say, hey, we're going to solve a transaction cost problem with the distribution of content? And oh, by the way, that ended up with a
Giving us,
little bit of digital rights,
yeah,
especially there at the early, creating a little bit of switching cost, which then allowed for the building of some barriers to entry, if you will, or some
some
reasons why they wouldn't
more
go.
defects basically also.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And whether those economics were intentional or not, they became observable.
yeah. No, this is great. I'm always thinking like once people figure hindsight is genius and foresight is completely like happenstance in a way, right? And so um I remember like when I first came to this country, right, and everything was all people were still devout followers of Microsoft and everything else, but like the iPhone when it came out, some folks actually realized the reach and the stickiness of just the device and how it can change people's lives and the early developers of even apps, Like there was like the two popular apps and everybody else, right? And I think that those people actually got like 98 or 99% of the value out of the early, like let's call it V1 of the iTunes
Yeah.
platform, if you want to
Yeah.
call it, right? Because they just understood what was happening, and then they also had the patience to like go through all the kinks that the platform did and did not actually provide, and it was incredible. And I remember for the very first time when I saw like an iPhone, like the it actually looked like the new mouse now, right? Like, and if you remember that, and it had this like really four apps, and we're like, well, this is a better BlackBerry, right? And
Yeah.
but the people that
At the
understood,
time,
yeah, the value of just iMessage, and they were like, wait, this can actually go across platforms and stuff, and that changed people's lives. And I clearly remember my friend Hussein telling me like way back in the day, like, hey, this is a trend to follow, because this will actually change how people develop code and reach other people. And if this becomes something, there's a huge business behind it. And again, just like you said, I was like, yeah, but my BlackBerry Messenger is great. Like I'm not switching, right? And lo and behold, today everybody has an iPhone, right? So
yeah. And we can sort of go into the Android and iPhone kind of
yep.
contest, but I do want to circle just quickly back to Kelly's question, because going in those sort of accidental, I think what's changed over, say, the last 15 years is the understanding of the sources of value in these types of systems is a lot better. And so you see intentional efforts to create network effects, for example. Um,
Which is an interesting question, because I think, if you look especially in B2B SaaS, the model, right, often relies on VC funding to get going, right? And I think that when you look at that systemically, what are some of the downsides and what are some of the upsides? Is there a better model for that being the vehicle for which companies are able to move forward to a point where they can prove out the value or not, right? Tens of millions, if not more, are often invested in companies who spend that money to acquire users with the idea of creating the network effects. And then, of course, some of them just fall flat and turn out not to work. Maybe hundreds of millions were spent. Now others work. Is this a good model from a systemic? Is it the only model, sort of given our regulated capitalistic system? Thoughts on
so I
that?
love this question, and it gives me a chance to jump up on a soapbox. So observe me jumping up on a soapbox, because I have the good fortune to work with a lot of different organizations. Many of them are incumbents, so firms that have existing businesses and sort of more linear value chain business models that are interested in becoming platforms. And then what I'll often see is they're not ready for that. And the reason is that their technology can't support it. And so they have fragmented, siloed technologies, stacks, if you will, data in different divisions where you'd want to be able to pool that. And so there's this sort of first step of digital transformation. And I promise you, I'll tie it back to answering your question about VCs, because and so where you end up starting with some of those organizations to say, hey, rather than jumping immediately to a platform with network effects, how about just building a really good product or service? Like the old fashioned way that somebody really wants, and you'll start to amass a single type of user and offer them a value proposition. But the caveat is with the understanding that in the long run, you're going to want to make it open. You're going to want to be able to connect um, cross-site users so they could interact, because you don't have every smart idea internally, and you're not going to have the engineering capability to create every new bit of functionality internally. And then think about the social kind of interaction features, and then how can you start to light those up over time? And what I just laid out to you is in effect like a 3 to 5 year journey that says, where are you going to invest to get going? what's the next source of value that you're going to start to light up in terms of potential network effects.
So
And
when you
so
say
then,
build, sorry, when you say build a product, are you saying identify the user that you would like to exist if you have built out the network effects and then find a product that meets their needs? Because if you think of something like Fiverr, for example, right? What's the product that would have started the chain essentially? Like, yeah,
yeah,
sure,
no,
you could do
I'm
a template
talking
for
more.
freelancers.
No, sorry to,
Are you talking more of SaaS, like B2B SaaS? Yeah. Okay, I think
definitely the
that model
second.
makes sense.
Yeah, in the Fiverr, you're a marketplace from the get-go, and you have to mobilize both sides of the market, and you have to have liquidity, and you've got to think about managing those two sides simultaneously. I'm definitely talking more of the kind of SaaS, um, where you could deliver a service using your own technology, but over time, you could start to layer in different sources of value.
Do you have a comment on the VC piece?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just hit a
I just
derail
want
there.
to get
He's going there.
But the first part was a preamble because, you know, if you think about what I said, I'm talking about literally building a product or a service in a way that we would have thought of quite some time ago. And you say, well, what about the VCs that are going to light you up in network effects? Which I'm, an observer of, a studier of, a student of. But until you have nailed down a really compelling product or service, it's almost, what's the point? Because that's a good way to ramp you up and then explode. Um,
and,
or,
and
or, or
would it
fail
be
miserably. And from the VC's point of view, look, if they get one great success out of 10, that model works. But for those other 9 entrepreneur teams, they might have wanted to go a little more slowly and a little more deliberately and have a higher chance of individual success, whether or not that would cap their long run upside. And so you may have a kind of a mismatch, if you will, in those models of who wants what. And that's something I'd look out for. And, if you're going to talk to individual startups and say, hey, think about who wants what in this equation, and ask some questions of the VCs that you're working with. And, you know, often super firms, tons of great information, connections, advice. But, be thoughtful about who everybody's exit strategies in these.
Yeah, I have one question for you, but like just for our listeners, like when you look at a VC and you look at their fund, the entire fund does not need a 10x or better return. The majority of the fund is just looking for 2 to 3x return. There's a smaller part of the fund that's looking for 3 to 5x, and then you have moonshots. And so I just want to say that I think it's a pretty interesting time to be talking about VCs, anyways. But the fund structure does not require 10x, and there will be many VCs out there and other types of folks that will lend you money for just a 2 to 3x return, and it actually brings the pressure of an exit down a lot. So you can actually do what Geoff is saying is just build an amazing product with an amazing sticky value proposition that is scalable. Because what happens, at least from what I see, is people just build, 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 and now you have like 30 features, and only 2 were actually required. So I don't know if you have a thought on this, because I know you went to the product line, but I would even go further and say just build 2 amazing features and serve them to a million people and just see what happens, right? And you may actually find yourself exactly where Geoff's recommending is. You'll just have a platform after that.
Yeah. Or if you don't, at least you've got an amazing
Yes.
product or service
Yes.
and have had success in that. But of
Totally.
course, as a platform guy, I'm always thinking ahead to, okay, but think about the architecture of
Yep.
that and sort of try to control the technical debt,
Yep.
if you will, because as you go down
Yep.
I'm going to iterate and build this amazing product or service and do it in this sort of rapid development cycle, that that kind of fights against the horizontal scalable architectures. And so kind of trying to keep those in balance is one of the challenges.
Geoff, have you researched, or just like I'm sure you have, but I'll ask the question. Like, I found that bootstrap companies remove technical debt much faster than venture-backed companies, and they're very intentional about it too. They will actually take some time, and then because they don't have the same growth goals either, right? They'll actually go and remove both technical debt and operational debt, by the way, also, right? They'll look at the back office processes and stuff and say, look, these few things just don't make any sense, or they're causing friction for our users, so let's just remove them.
So I haven't studied that systematically, but that certainly tracks. And I've actually talked to a number of leaders about their deliberate strategies. For example, to build more of a horizontal system and then having to essentially tax their vertical P&L
Yep.
Leadership. And so this is sort of from the CEO's point of view, they're like, well, they don't love having to double pay running the kind of incumbent or the legacy infrastructure while they're retiring that tech debt, but everybody more or less understands it. And I told them they had to, so they it became kind of part of the mandate. But of course, realizing that the CEO answers to a board, and if it's a public company, then to some sort of larger investment community.
So, what are some of the ways that, if you are starting on that journey, that you can avoid technical debt? Because some of the things that, I would advise to companies is in B2B SaaS, really, is one thing that's happened in the last few years is people have really come around to the REST API model, right? So, in most verticals and ecosystems, people are using that if they're potentially also using others, but the numbers is really high. The other thing is looking at the data models in your space. Asher and I did a study of 650 people last year in terms of asking them about their partnerships, and to companies that were up to 2001 people, technology partners were the most important partners, and even for enterprises it was the second most important partners. And I think, part of the ways you can ensure that you're going to be able to open up if you want to, and potentially even become a platform, but if not, plug into other platforms, is by looking at your data models from day one and making sure they actually align with the models in the industry. Because otherwise, when you go to integrate, you're putting a huge burden on your developers, and you're also ensuring that third-party developers and partner developers are not going to want to integrate to you unless you give them even more money, right? Like, you want to make it as easy as possible and remove the friction. But any other advice, like beyond that, in terms of how companies can make sure they don't get 3 years down the road and have like an almost insurmountable amount of technical debt?
So first, I just want to emphasize how much I agree with what you just said. So, um, you know, love the way that you framed it. So where I see, and we've done some work. I was fortunate to be on this World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Advanced Manufacturing, and I can only say that once without garbling it. So,
I'm impressed you remembered it. It is a mouthful.
yeah. So what we were looking at, we looked at a number of things, but one of the really cool things was the way that new technology got ingested into larger firms. Um, and the reason that I point this out is, I think it'll partly answer your question. We we saw multiple archetypes, and so at the beginning of these transformation stages, you saw a lot of point solutions. And point solutions are kind of end to end. They solve a specific problem. And so I'll give you an example. Um, let's see, Unilever has a number of factories around the world. And they have these drying towers. And the drying towers are for detergent products at the end of the manufacturing process. And it used to be that they kind of had a black art with the operators, which was from practice and skills and experience. And what they were able to do was apply some artificial intelligence, machine learning, and really optimize that process. And you'd say, how much could this matter? Well, it mattered by tens of millions of dollars in terms of energy savings in in the overall system. And then they were able to roll that improvement out across, say, 10 factories. And so it had a massive impact, but it was still a point solution because that wasn't solving any kind of scalable architecture. They were taking one innovation and then moving it across. But you should certainly do those. However, that doesn't create the efficiencies of putting in a layer of infrastructure. To your point, Kelly, about sort of uniform data models, uniform APIs that people can integrate to at low cost. And so what you see firms do, especially the incumbents, is sort of pursue more of these point models. Like, find me the best in breed of insert X, whether it's a chat feature, a natural language processing thing, literally a fax to PD, to machine readable text, which is an insane thing that actually really still exists in a lot of company workflows. And then go find the best of that. But every one of those best ofs have to be integrated into the broader system. And so one of the questions you might ask is, do you have to always go after best of, or is 80 or 90% that is scalable and plays nicely with all the rest of your stuff the better way to think about it? And then the next thing, of course, is to think about how you modernize, for example, your data models. Lots of companies don't have that. So then they'll build a data lake, and then they'll hydrate the data lake by ingesting a bunch of data sources from all across the organization. A massive, expensive, and time-consuming process. And then they sit at the end and go, well, did I actually prioritize that right? Or did I just go after grabbing everything I could and getting it in there? Because now people are starting to question the value proposition of having done all this in the first place, which then gets you into how do you stage some of these investments and transformations. I'm not sure that's an exact answer to your question, Kelly, but I think it kind of touches on some of the challenges, especially that firms that have big legacy systems deal with.
So
Yeah,
what's your take on the is best of breed versus 80% that scalable is good enough?
Um, so so of course I'll give you the economist's answer. It depends. And the it depends is that best of breed and that last 5 or 10% so valuable
Oh,
because you
yes.
can roll it across the system that
Yep.
it trumps, if you will,
Yep.
the kind of cost that you're still incurring, because every one of these things bears an integration cost, and then they all bear some sort of life cycle management cost over time. And so the more kind of one-offs you do, the more spaghetti you put into the system that eventually gets unwieldy.
Yeah. This may not be a question for you, but do you have a viewpoint on like managing like integrations outside of the company versus managing integrations inside of the company?
I'll riff on integrations, and then you can decide whether or
Okay.
not I had anything useful to say. So I think the integration issue, especially with the kind of B2B SaaS or B2B platforms, is fascinating because it comes down to kind of who pays and why. So, for example, if you're going to onboard a new partner, everybody wants somebody else to cover the integration,
Yep.
and that's not always possible. And then do you embed it in the recurring kind of licensing fee? Do you just explicitly call it out and say, hey, we have a third party consulting company that we have an arrangement with, talk to them and they'll be able to help? Or do you, and this often happens early on, do you mount your own internal consulting effort because you're a relatively young company, nobody external will pay any attention to you, and you haven't really got enough routinized systems that it would make any sense. But then as you scale, you're going to have to bring on some outside partners. I think there's a huge amount around integration, and then zeroing in on that to try to make that as sort of low a friction factor as possible.
Yeah.
To go back to the firms with all these legacy systems, as someone who's working with a lot of different companies, do you see smaller companies who are designing their systems from day one to be scalable? And what sort of competitive advantage is this? Because we've yet to see a company really, as far as I know, fully sort of take that competitive advantage, because it should be a competitive advantage, right? As you said, it's extremely costly to maintain and service these legacy systems and to build around them. So one would think that you could have younger firms who, cropped up in the last 5 years and were just so technological savvy that they did best in breed in terms of the architectural design of all their systems, and that should propel them ahead. But do you see that? How much of a competitive advantage is it? Is it not enough to overcome sort of the advantage that the incumbent firms have in a lot of other ways of already existing, out having the audience, the brand, the market?
Couple of answers. So one is, one would hope that with the focus that comes from a young company, they're going to sort of be born, if you will, horizontal and platform ready. But you ask a great question, which is, where does that show up and how does it matter? And if they're primarily servicing in a B2B way, in a SaaS way, kind of other companies, you're still having to integrate to those larger partners and deal with them. So that scalability that the startup has, until they become a platform themselves and get large, may not show up. And the other, so that's kind of point one. And you're just getting me, I don't want to say spitballing, but you're getting me kind of reacting to the question. Part two is, and I think this is almost more relevant, it's amazing how fast rigidity sets in. So I've worked with some incumbent firms that you would have said, wow, that is about as digital cloud native as I've ever seen. And then you kind of scratch in and you go, oh my, they're locked into their original business model. And if they want to enable different types of ecosystem partners and different business models, even they, and insert name brand firm that everybody on planet Earth would recognize, even they have a big tech debt kind of refresh to do to be able to allow for this different business strategy as they try to pivot, because the core market started to stagnate on them. Firms that are literally less than 20 years old. So that I found fascinating as an academic, but a little bit shocking.
Is it because of the way management bonuses are structured?
I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think it has to do with they had a core business. They went after it.
Yeah.
They built scalability around that, but the
Oh,
business model itself was this more kind of subscription based. And the reason I'm pointing this out is this is where a lot of SaaS companies get themselves into, whether they're B2C or B2B. And then if you want to pivot to, oh, I want to be an open platform and maybe build some marketplaces or have some integrations and share in the revenue streams potentially of my integration partners, or not, depending on sort of how you think about that value proposition. But all of those things then require a whole new engineering roadmap.
Yep.
And they require essentially a platform feature roadmap and a platform product management function, and then an ecosystem management function, a bunch of stuff that even a cloud native firm just simply doesn't have.
Yeah.
Which I thought super fascinating and lucky to get to kind of be on the inside of some of those conversations at the management team level.
Yeah, and then they go look at the plumbing and they're like, "Wow, this is going to be like 4 years down the path." And they're like, in some cases, they're like, "Well, who actually has the tribal knowledge to do this?" And that's why I made a joke a little bit. But like, I've been in a couple of conversations where like, wait, my bonus is actually like tied to this thing, and do I really want to do this, or should I just go over here and just go do this, and I'll be okay, you know?
Well, that's, I love your point there, because this is one of those channel conflict
Yep,
questions that you always get, which is once you open up, then
yep,
you potentially start to conflict with the sort of existing revenue stream.
yep,
And in particular, if you start offering a lower cost, self-serve, low friction sort of go to market, then you're going to be potentially bleeding out P&L,
yep,
some revenue from the existing groups. So that's a tension that has to be managed.
yeah, yeah.
Do you have
Sorry, go ahead, Kelly.
I was going to say, do you have thoughts on the monetization models around technology partnerships? Because that is something that I think the market in general is evolving quickly. And, I think some of the common ways that B2B SaaS companies try to monetize it is by putting on higher tier plans, for example, and trying to prompt people to upgrade for either all integrations or key integrations. Some people do have transactional marketplaces where integrations can be sold or the connected software can be sold. So you see both. I actually did a study a couple years ago of the 100 largest SaaS companies, and 14% of them had transactional app marketplaces. And then it went down from there. I looked at like Series D, C, and seed companies, and it got less and less. So, and there's a reason for that, right? Like it's a zero sum game. Nobody, if you want to buy all your like e-commerce stuff through Shopify, then you're not also going to go to Yapto, the loyalty reward, and try to buy everything there. So in these cases, not everyone can be, people can derive business value from them, no matter which party they are, but they can't all be monetizing them. So, thoughts on where we are with that and sort of what considerations are and where the market's headed?
Um, yes. So the B2B one in particular, I think is pretty interesting, because if you've got a robust kind of monthly or annual recurring revenue stream, then one of the things, and honestly, I learned this from Scott Brinker, um, was that
I'll let them know.
you let him know, and it was in a public forum. So this is he made a really compelling argument that it was worth the investment in building out the partnership platform, which means a lot of technology, a lot of management function, a lot of capabilities, in order to make the integration sticky. Because once you had at an end customer, you've got, for example, this SaaS software layer, um, HubSpot in this case, and then you've got multiple integration partners. Once that's true, then customers are much less likely to churn. And so, in terms of a lifetime value of a relationship or customer, it's a pretty straightforward metric. If you change the churn rate, that has a huge impact on that LTV. And so that's something that's worth directly investing in. So my pushback would be as follows. So I get that, but that's almost a one-time bump on the revenue. And what you've seen some of the really successful platform firms do is be able to layer in additional revenue streams. So that model is great, but it's an upsell model on sort of upsell you to the higher bandwidth, throughput, compute power, pick your industry in terms of what you're trying to upsell on the monthly fee. Um, but you could get some nonlinear scaling if you then start to build marketplaces on top that then start to add in new revenue streams. And where do you land on that? Well, it certainly made a lot of sense to get a number of partners involved, and then help sort of grow the value proposition and make the core product stickier in the long run. And I don't know. And you've seen some of what I think Brian had to say. This was a few years ago, that they're sort of holding the door open for potential percentage cuts depending upon the type of partner.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's a trade-off, right, between getting more partners building to you, and then taking the revenue. There's always going to be, I would say HubSpot is still currently not monetized. And I know from our partners' perspective, because other ecosystems that we compete with are, that it's a value add. It also calibrates their expectations, right? If you start paying somebody a significant amount, a cut every year, then you're going to want more back, and if you're not getting it, you're going to be dissatisfied. So um, I don't think there's an easy answer, and I that's why I think that it is like a tough question, and the models are going to continue to kind of evolve and grow in how they're sort of taking out value.
Well, and I mean, I like the kind of gradual approach on that, because what I've seen with some other organizations is they kind of get starry eyes on revenue streams, and they try to monetize before they've actually generated enough value
Yeah.
that they would have a claim on that. And one of the places you see that is around data. So firms will say, well, my data is worth, a huge amount. And so if you want to be able to use it, aggregate it, potentially create products that you could sell from it, of course, you have to pay me. And that's fine if it's true that a lot of value is getting created. But especially early on, it isn't. And you can put a lot of friction on those systems that prevent them from ever getting out of the starting blocks.
Yeah.
I think. Go ahead.
I was just going to pivot a little bit to the the evolution of value realization that like Geoff just talked about, because I'm like, I think the stuff that we're talking about is cool, but I want to hear what Geoff has learned and can share with us.
Well, so if you look at archetypes, and try to categorize them, they do kind of break out into. Let me just pull a slide here, because I've done a little bit of thinking around this, into things that you would say, okay, that's a software as a service type of thing, and it's going to have a standalone value proposition. And so that's kind of that: build a great product or service from the get-go and build a set of users.
Uh-huh.
Um, and then over time, what you would expect to see is the firm intentionally find a new source. Now, whether that's new features or whether that's going to come out of user to user interactions, that's a decision to make. You're still a traditional firm if you simply build out new features. So think, for example, of Excel. So Excel is like the Swiss Army knife. It's got a gazillion features in it. I can derive a lot of value just sitting in my office and doing analysis or taxes. Um, on the other hand, it's still embedded remarkably after decades in the workflow of lots of companies. They email sheets around, they get populated, they end up becoming kind of reporting. So that creates a peer-to-peer network effect. I am old enough to remember using Lotus 123, which is not a particularly popular spreadsheet program anymore, but we used it at GE. Actually, we replaced a proprietary in-house system with that over time. And it mattered hugely that you were on the same standard. You wouldn't want to have two people trying to collaborate. So that creates a kind of a network effect between same types of users. Not a lot of cross-site network effect. There
Uh-huh.
aren't a lot of plugins. There are some, of course, optimization solvers, some data analytics stuff. But for the most part, you're looking at a value proposition that is a lot of standalone value and then a lot of same side collaboration value. So then the question you ask is, okay, in these sort of SaaS B2B models, you've innovated to create the core product or service. All right, now what? Are you going to jam a bunch more features at people? And that's your kind of your engineering roadmap. And that's fine. That's one way of increasing potentially the value proposition, and maybe capture some of that with price, or at least capture it with retention. So there's sort of a couple ways of thinking about it. Or are you going to create collaboration tools so that you create value propositions from users interacting with other users in a more effective way? Or are you going to open it up to outside ecosystem partners and create value by extending functionality or some sort of cross-side or creating marketplaces? They're all reasonable alternatives, and you just have to be thoughtful and intentional and lay it out. And, run the experiments where it makes sense to experiment, be intentional if you have enough sort of conviction and knowledge about what's going to work.
Yeah, I would. Unfortunately, we're going to run out of time today. But the social side of this thing and the role communities play in supporting these platforms, I'd love to share some data with you. Maybe we do a follow on to this podcast because because I'm in it and we're building it. We've been building this thing for 4 years. Just the sheer amount of value that is unlocked in bringing prospects, customers, partners all together just in the guy. It's focused on just connection and meaningful connections, and those connections existing over time, right? And then content gets created, ideas get created, and this you can actually start down this path of intentionality through a community while the rest of your business is actually kind of finding accidental value, if you want to call it, right? And both can be in play, and there is a flywheel of sorts, if you want to call it, right, that gets created, and you can get there.
I mean, I think it's literally one of the critical columns, if you will. I mean, I think of sort of standalone value. There's same side network effect value, which is this community. And then there's cross side network effect value, which are these marketplaces or app stores or service integrations, whatever label you want to put on it. And the system over time accounts for, comprises all of those in terms of the value proposition.
And sometimes you just have to, again, we go back, we started this conversation with the whole VC thing. And given that I'm building a revenue back company, right? Like you just sometimes just let it happen, right? And just naturally it'll come to you. And all ideas have been thought of before, but they just slowly manifest through how customers utilize your products and services. And they'll tell you, right? And which I think is still the best way of building a company is just listen to your customers and stay close to the post-sale value, which not a lot of management teams actually really spend a lot of time on, at least in the early days, because they're just trying to get to go-to-market fit.
I was going to say they have a lot going on, so some sympathy I think is there. Kelly, you look slightly. I'm detecting a skepticism. So
no, not at all. Actually, I'm just noticing we don't have much time left, and there's a question I really want to ask that is tangentially related to this one, which I think it has more to do with the community trust angle, which ties in, which is this issue that platforms struggle with, which is the competitive cooperation line, right? And it's not just SaaS, because if you look on Amazon, for example, they've been criticized recently for pumping their own brands and for bombarding people with ads, but that's a separate issue, or maybe related. But their own brand is often heavily prioritizing the results. And from the consumer side, despite some journalists writing articles about it, I'm not sure how much it's impacting that experience, but SaaS companies have the same thing, right? Platforms end up building out features into their platforms that compete with integration partners. Thoughts both from the side of the partner, who has to often build their entire business heavily reliant on the ecosystem that could be made obsolete, whether it's because Amazon starts selling their batteries for $2 or because Salesforce, for example, builds out a CPQ solution that it didn't have before. Best practice on both sides of how to think about that?
Yeah, so awesome point. And this has been happening pretty much since the history of platforms. So if you go back, for example, to Windows as an operating system, it used to be that if you wanted a dictionary or a spell checker, you literally bought that as a service. Or if you wanted to create a PDF, you had to have Adobe. Over time, those features and functionalities tend to get absorbed into the core stack of the platform. And so, why does that happen? Well, especially in the B2B world, if you think about where a lot of those add-on developments come from, they come because they're helping a specific industry sector or a specific partner. And so, for example, it might be automotive manufacturing or banking, or it could be, mineral extraction, and they'll have some unique needs in that industry. And then you'll have people that will innovate and develop on top of the core platform. However, what ends up happening is you may end up discovering something that every vertical wants. And so then the question is, does it make sense anymore for that to be an ecosystem provided capability that requires its own external integrations and its own external revenue stream? Or does it make sense for over time to absorb those things that cut across multiple customer types over time? And of course, it's the second. And so then you end up, because the end users are going to want you to solve that integration problem. They're not going to want to have, if every end user wants the same thing, then it should be in the core.
Mhm.
And so, because what you're using the ecosystem for is both discovery and also to serve an idiosyncratic set of demands. That's kind of the magic, if you will, of a long tail of needs and wants. That doesn't solve the problem of how do you keep the incentives aligned. And so you have to have reputation as the platform for not wiping your ecosystem out and just tomorrow saying, well, guess what? We copied it. We bought a clone. We did this, and now your revenue stream is torched. That does not engender a lot of love for the ecosystem. And so that's part of that kind of governance and ecosystem strategy, is being a good partner. Part of being a partner is to say, well, here's our roadmap. And in about 15 to 20 months, this is going to happen. And we'd love to buy your technology or give you some sort of an exit on it. But, in the long run, for the good of the overall system, this is going to get absorbed, and not kind of tomorrow surprise you.
Yeah.
And because, and are they going to love it? No. But on the other hand, and Guido Jouret, let's see, he was at Cisco at the time we did an interview. So this is quite some number of years ago, about 15. We're talking about exactly this issue. And he said, well, often what will happen is the same solution will start to get provided by multiple end vendors. And so whatever high profits they were making are starting to get competed away anyway. Whether that's a story you tell them to make them feel better, at least, or there's truth to it, that's an empirical question. But the broader point is not surprising the ecosystem partners, being, having a roadmap, being really upfront that can happen, and why, and sort of under what conditions would it make sense that we as the main platform would do such a thing.
Yeah, I think transparency goes a long way. And also the bigger picture of establishing that trust, which you can do through how you handle it, but also in other components of the partner experience, that if you've built that reservoir up,
Yep.
it's going to be less jarring.
It's interesting because over the last 6-7 months, if you just, let's say, go by what's been shared on social, there's a lot of like, love the ecosystem, like talk. And just this week, I just started seeing threads around, well, my partners are competing with me, and so what you just said could be more true, and we're going to see a little bit more of it. Okay, I feel like we could talk for hours. Maybe we should do that one day and just like do a marathon podcast, right? But Geoff, like, thank you so much for spending some time with us. Are there 2 or 3, let's call them platform designers, that come to mind that you recommend we bring on this show?
Well, I would certainly hope you'd talk with one of my main, really with all my co-authors, Marshall Van Alstyne, if you haven't already, and Sangeet Chowdhury. I think in the marketplace area, Peter Evans, who's been working with McFadyen, would be an interesting person to speak with. And so, yeah, I think that those are at least some of the main co-author ones.
Super. All right. I think that's great for today. Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Unlearn, and we'll be back.
Yeah, and actually, and there is one other person, I think Diane Finkhausen. When she was at GE, she did a lot of work with the ecosystem kind of strategy that they had. GE, of course, has had its own challenges, but I think she'd be an interesting person to speak with as well. Happy to make that connection.
Super.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to Unlearn. Subscribe wherever you listen and visit unlearnpodcast.com for the transcripts.